Hello, I'm Maddy Harland, and 30 years ago I co-founded Permaculture Magazine with Tim Harland. And in those 30 years we've heard so many stories of hope and regeneration, and I wanted today to share some of this with you in a talk called Cultivating Hope in a Challenging World. So we humans are social animals. We like to gather, share mutual interests, talk, touch, interact on many levels. And as we near the third year of living in a pandemic, many of us yearn to meet up rather than share on screens, but we can't at the moment. And in many ways this strange digitalised world is allowing us to share more deeply with more and more people. And even my more solitary friends who enjoy their own company are beginning to get a little bit fed up with the absence of human society. So this led me to think, well, how do we refill the well of hope? I was thinking this particularly because of the outcome of COP26 last year, the climate negotiations being really so poor, and the idea that we might start doing stuff to mitigate climate change by around 2050 is such a poor decision on the behalf of humanity. It really is the story of Don't Look Up, the recent DiCaprio and Streep film which I watched at Christmas, all about the meteorite coming to hit Earth and cause a mass extinction event, and us humans being more concerned about social media and what celebrity is, marriages breaking up and the midterm elections and, you know, political gain and money. Big time money, and it felt like a little bit like an allegory of my own life, having been campaigning for regenerative practices and highlighting the dangers of unchecked climate change for these last 30 years. And really feeling like I was in an echo chamber of my own sound, really not reaching more than a few people. So in part I laughed during that film, and in part it hurt, and it was quite painful to watch. So Joanna Macy, the eco-philosopher and activist, talks about the idea of maintaining the gaze, so we do not look away from the problems of the world. How do we have the inner strength and resilience to continue to maintain the gaze, not just for a year or even 5 years, but for decades, and still carry on with the work that we're doing? This is something that I've thought about a lot over the last few decades, because it is indeed a fine art. My lifelong strategy on a very personal level has been to garden, is to grow plants and enjoy the elements, the rain, the sun, the crisp winter mornings, the turning of the seasons, the cycles of the moon. That has taken me into a deep rhythm, and I always experience a huge sense of excitement at the beginning of every growing season when I start to plant my seeds and tender my seedlings. Another strategy I have had is to make things. It takes my focus out exclusively out of the intellect, out of the mental level of life, and brings it into the body. And when we start to embody our feelings and our thoughts in our life and in our actions, that's when we begin to heal and become empowered. So it's been very, very revealing for me in the last few months to find myself living in temporary accommodation on the Somerset Levels near Glastonbury, with no obligation to tend a garden, no access to a workshop to make stuff, and with none of my crafting materials around me. I've had to really draw deep on the beautiful nature of the area as one of my sole sources of renewal, and I've done a lot of permaculture publishing as well, so it hasn't all been bad. But the point of this is we need to find our niche. We need to find the things that nurture and feed us. And a lot of people who are landless really suffer in the way that they just can't grow in the same way. So if you've got a garden, if you have access to land, really celebrate it and really appreciate it. It's a gift. It's one of life's gifts, and gratitude is a great secret of happiness and reciprocity. Being grateful with nature brings even more of nature's bounty into our life. And this is why community projects are so important. And I hear wonderful stories of community projects all over the world, of school gardens, of woodland and forest projects, and projects run by passionate people, often with very little support and funding, who are able to power through all sorts of obstacles to run them. It takes a huge amount of love and dedication, and there are so many pioneering permaculturists doing this work, as I said, all over the world. Just this morning I was reading about Doug and Claire King-Smith, who run a community woodland project in Dartmoor in the southwest of England. They've had all sorts of struggles raising funds, discovering their woodland was infested with a pest that meant that they had to clear fell what was a larch monoculture that they bought. Instead of doing continuous cover forestry where you punch holes in the forest canopy and plant broadleaves, and you gradually convert a monoculture into a biodiverse woodland full of broadleaf species. So they have, against the odds, done incredible work, and they've replanted a whole broadleaf woodland. They've worked with their local community. They've opened up the woodland from a private space and brought people in. They've done all sorts of skill sharing courses. They've created enough income generation to sustain the woodland and keep it independent, and they've managed to push their way through planning restrictions which stop them from building things like stores and barns that any small forest enterprise needs. And they've got planning permission to build beautiful timber frame traditional barns from oak framed timbers. What I love about this project is the mix. It's the potent mix of habitat restoration, of biodiversity, of learning and sharing the skills of woodland stewardship, of learning how to generate income from this project, and then this opening up of private land and sharing it with the local community and with local volunteers, not only to share skills but to build community, to build a woodland culture and to create new friendships. And we need this in our fractured and broken world. This is what we need, and so many permaculture projects are providing this kind of work. And I know from my time at the Sustainability Centre, an educational project in Hampshire on the south coast of England, that this kind of project can mean the difference between life and death for some people. We know from our experience that, particularly with some young people who are very lost, that don't see the point of living anymore, they've come to this project and it's turned their life around. It's given them community, it's given them new skills, it's given them a sense of a possible career, and it's also been deeply healing on a level of mental health. So we really need to value and support these small community permaculture projects in our areas, in our regions. And if I remain in temporary accommodation for too much longer and I run out of all my publishing work to do, well, that's very unlikely, but if I do stay here much longer, I'm going to have to start volunteering locally for my own well-being and for my own connection to the land. There are so many stories of hope in the permaculture movement all over the world, of passionate, talented people doing great things against the odds and with little funding. And these stories should be headline news, and they should be told with nuanced subtlety and intelligence, not just in cliches by the media. These are the stories that very often we really don't hear enough about. Over 3 years ago, I started the Permaculture Magazine prize fund, and this was explicitly to support these kind of small projects all over the world. It's provided a deep well of hope for me and others to draw upon. Over a period of 3 years, we have awarded $3,000 to a number of small projects, and we haven't asked for feasibility studies, we haven't asked for financial reports after the award, and we haven't demanded targets. We've basically done our due diligence, we've looked at what the project's been doing, they've given us an application, of course, and then we've made the award to celebrate and express our respect for the work that's been done in many, many different countries of the world. It's a yearly fund of over $35,000, and we work now in partnership with the much bigger Lush Spring Prize, who help us with that due diligence and with the collective responsibility of finding the right projects. And we know that that money is cycled many, many times in the local economy. It doesn't pay people in another country to administer it. It doesn't pay teachers to fly out to other countries to teach people. We're funding Indigenous and locally led trainings and projects, and we know that it makes a big difference. So we've supported many small grassroots projects over the years, and we've heard some amazing stories from them. We understand that setting up demonstration home gardens, for instance, has a radical effect on a family's nutrition and well-being. Techniques like mulching and swales, sharing seeds and trees, setting up tree nurseries, teaching seed saving from local varieties of food crops, rainwater harvesting, all these basic permaculture skill sharing techniques can make the difference between a family eating 1 meal a day and 3 meals a day. And when you eat 3 times a day, the whole picture of well-being and nutrition is radically changed. These home gardens also they also generate a surplus which can then go to market to make to bring modest funds into the family. And sometimes that can make a difference between a child being able to go to school or not go to school. So it's very, very significant work, from tiny pieces of funding to see these projects seeding out into a community. And there's often a passionate pioneer on the local level who gets this process, this permaculture design approach, and creates a home garden. And that home garden then becomes an example and a demonstration site as well. And what succeeds spreads. People don't do things because they're told to do things. They do things because they work and they want a bit of that success for themselves. So I'm told that some of these projects that have been funded have not only spread out in local villages or even watersheds, but over entire bioregional areas beyond even the watershed. It makes a vast difference. These trainings also involve farm-based projects, so encouraging farmers to switch to locally adapted crops, helping to fund plant and tree nurseries, teaching how to build fuel-efficient stoves, not only rocket stoves but also cob stoves, basically stoves from materials that are free and come easily to hand, and these can radically reduce the need for firewood, which reduces deforestation and the hours and hours that it takes to gather wood, and that time can be spent gardening. They create training hubs demonstrating techniques and design processes by example, and these methods, as I've said, that succeed travel across whole regions, exponentially improving the lives of entire communities. And these projects have also funded and gone into huge refugee camps where people are living absolutely in the direst poverty, and have got them home gardening as well, and generating income and skill sharing, and creating a healthier nutrition and also a sense of hope and resilience. I know that permaculture has the power to transform lives, not only in the third or the two-thirds world, but in the first world as well. And I've seen evidence of those projects everywhere, in most countries of the world. Permaculture really needs to be taught in schools and colleges. It needs to have hubs in every community to share skills. It needs to be seeded out and be available to everyone. I spoke about nature a little earlier. I just know from my own experience 30 years ago, I, with Tim, took a bare field that had been drenched with agricultural chemicals, had no topsoil whatsoever, and slowly we created a forest garden. And that forest garden grew with over 80 edible fruit and nut trees and other exotic trees like peppers, but we also had wildflower meadows and a home garden area for annual vegetables, and we planted soft fruit and climbing vines. We really filled this garden with food and nature, and from a place where it was absolutely crawling with pests and The soil was broken and completely denuded, with no nutrition in it at all. There were no worms, let alone any microscopic life. There was certainly nothing living. There was nothing living in the soil. It transformed itself into a biodiverse, beautiful paradise. And in the last year that we were living there, in the last 2 years actually, from this broken ecology bloomed orchids in our wildflower meadows, and thousands of species of insects and animals and plants, both volunteer and planted by ourselves. And that taught me from practical experience how quickly nature regenerates, given the opportunity, given just a few tools and introductions from humans. When we help nature bounces back with incredible vigour. There are so many stories of larger landscape regeneration as well. I'm in the Somerset Levels at the moment, as I said, near Glastonbury, and there's been a tradition of mining peat here for horticultural peat for gardens, which of course is not a good thing to do because it releases carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and adds to the problem of climate change. But the peat mining has left great big drained areas of peat bog that have become lakes, and the nature conservation trusts have come in and worked on these areas, planted, encouraged reed beds, made walkways, created nature reserves, and built on the biodiversity of the area. So instead of being sort of post-industrial wasteland, they've become beautiful, thriving nature reserves. And last autumn, I was so delighted to watch 2 birds of prey, marsh harriers, hunting over this landscape of regenerated peatland, peat bogs. In 1971, because of agricultural chemicals like DDT, illegal shooting and egg collection, there was just 1 breeding pair of this beautifully magnificent bird in the whole of Britain. Now, today, there are over 400 breeding pairs, and they're found from all the way from the southwest up the east coast and up higher into the north. So that's just 50 years for 1 species to regenerate in a sustainable way, and just a few decades of my ravaged, broken field that used to be an arable field, regenerating on such a level that it was teeming with species and edible species as well for us to eat. So I know that we can regenerate this earth both on a large scale and a small scale, and we do it by creating ecosystems. And I'm fascinated by the regenerative agriculture movement, people like Shepard, who basically understood this early on and started creating ecosystems on which to farm with nature rather than eradicating nature and taking the petrochemical route. And we know that the benefits are vast. They benefit biodiversity, they sequester carbon, and they replace these endangered species who are part of our larger family, who we belong to. You know, we are creatures of nature as well. Nature's not separate from us, and somehow we need to overcome that sense of separation. But diversity, let me end by just saying something. I want to speak a little bit more about the permaculture movement becoming far more diverse. There's a lot of talk about permaculture being white guys selling expensive courses to other people and being a very white-based movement. 30 years ago, there were very few women permaculture teachers in the world and very few childcare facilities if you wanted to go and learn permaculture design, and it was really expensive as well. One of my early male book authors refused to accept me as an editor for his book because I was a woman. I think he thought I wouldn't understand the subject that he was writing about, which was very down-to-earth, practical DIY. So that's the kind of thing that women were up against 30 years ago. And now we have many, many highly talented women teachers, trainers, community activists, ecologists, scientists, researchers, all working in and around the permaculture movement. And I have a fantastic group of women who are writing for permanent publications, not only writing articles for Permaculture Magazine, but have authored some very definitive and important books under our imprint permanent publications, and I'm really proud of them. We have male authors as well, and we're proud of those as well, but we have a really healthy balance now of men and women. But what of gender diversity, of those who are non-binary, gay, transsexual? Do they belong in the permaculture movement? Of course, everyone belongs in this regenerative movement. And whilst we have an incredibly inspiring network of permaculturists in Africa, South America and Asia, permaculture is still predominantly a white movement in Europe and North America. And I know that's uncomfortable to say, but we have to look at this, we have to sustain the gaze of this, and we need to address racism, whether it's systemic and unconscious or active, and call it out and open our doors to more and more people. In the past, when we've put a person of colour on the cover of Permaculture Magazine, we've actually sold less copies in stores. That's been the reality, and that's a horrible and disempowering reality. But we as publishers are not going to stop just because it affects us economically. So in February, when you see issue 111 in a store somewhere in the world, please buy it and support the presence of the beautiful, talented woman, Poppy Okacha, on the cover. The world's changing slowly, but it is changing, and we are becoming more aware. First worlders need to expose and acknowledge our colonial past and our deeply embedded privilege. Our industrial growth model has brought many, many benefits to us, but it's also brought a legacy of terrible injustices and suffering. The World Health Organization estimates that there are about 15% of the Earth's inhabitants that are disabled. But by contrast, in Indigenous communities, that statistic can go up to 50%. There remains 360 million Indigenous people in the world, and they host 80% of the land that holds the world's biodiversity. Their cultures and their lands must be protected. And there are many excellent permaculture people working in community all over the world who are working towards these aims of social inclusion, social justice, and conservation of biodiversity. And I'm really deeply inspired by them, and I'd just like to express my respect and gratitude to those people. Long may you continue. You know who you are. We can only change the world by changing ourselves, and not everyone can be an activist working at the cutting edge. My resolution for this year is to continue to educate myself and speak out even when it's uncomfortable and even when it might not be a very popular thing to do. So let's give the oxygen of inclusion and non-violence, and let's question unconscious privilege and prejudice. Let's also remember to cultivate hope and not let our personal wells run dry. Thank you very much for listening.
I want to garden so